The desert was quiet, far too quiet for a morning after rain. Clara Hayes had grown up hearing that silence in the wilderness meant danger, but she hadn't truly believed it until now. The sun was only beginning to edge over the jagged red rocks of Apache Canyon, throwing long shadows like reaching fingers across the ground. Her wagon creaked with every turn of the wheels, and the mule pulling it seemed nervous, ears twitching back and forth. Behind her, there was no laughter, no familiar voices. The rest of the small caravan 3 wagons strong was gone, swallowed by fire and gunfire the evening before. Clara had hidden herself in a ravine as the attack unfolded, clutching her skirts to keep from being seen. She had never felt so useless, crouching in the dirt while men she had known, even the children, screamed into the flames. When the air grew thick with smoke and silence settled again, she emerged only to find the wagon's blackened husks, the survivors scattered or dead. She had thought herself lucky to escape. That luck ended with the soft drumming of hooves behind her. Clara froze. Her hands tightened around the reins, though the mule already felt the danger, snorting and shifting nervously. The sound grew louder, closer, until a shadow swept across her. She turned her head just enough to see the rider paint streaked across his face, hair bound with leather, rifle gleaming in the rising light. And then another, and another. Within moments, she was surrounded. Her breath hitched, and she forced her chin high. She had heard of raids, of white captives taken south or west, of ransoms demanded and sometimes paid. But she had also heard of worse, of quick deaths and slower ones. The men's eyes flickered over her with unreadable intent. She wanted to scream, to fight, but some instinct told her stillness was safer. One of them dismounted, moving with a predator's grace. He was tall, broader than she expected, his chest painted with ochre streaks that gleamed in the sunlight. He carried a long knife at his hip, though it was his eyes that fixed her more firmly than any weapon. Dark, unblinking, they seemed to burn with a heat that was not just hatred. She would later learn his name, Fire Eyes, but in this moment, he was simply the embodiment of her fear. The others shouted in their tongue, the words too quick for Clara to follow. Her father had once traded with tribes farther north, and she recognized the cadence though not the meaning. The tall one answered sharply, and whatever he said silenced the others. He turned his gaze back to Clara, studying her as though weighing the cost of letting her live. Clara's lips trembled, though she pressed them together. She would not beg. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. Yet when the man stepped forward, pulling her roughly from the wagon, her knees buckled. She stumbled, the desert earth biting into her palms, and for an instant she thought he would strike her down then and there. Instead, he held her upright, steadying her in a grip that was both bruising and strangely careful. She realized with a jolt that he was young, not much older than she was, perhaps. His eyes lingered on her face, her hair, her trembling hands. He said something she could not understand, voice low and measured, and the men behind him laughed. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear it. Clara forced herself to speak, her voice cracking. "Please." "Don't." She stopped herself before finishing the thought. Begging for mercy had never saved anyone she'd known. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, fighting the urge to collapse. The tall man tilted his head as if her defiance puzzled him. Then he gestured, and 2 of the warriors seized her arms. The mule brayed in panic, but a rifle butt silenced it, and Clara flinched as the animal crumpled. Her last hope of flight was gone. They led her away from the wagon, deeper into the canyon where the rock walls rose high and the shadows thickened. Every step echoed with finality, as though she were walking into her own grave. And yet, through the terror, one thought rooted itself stubbornly in her mind. I am not done. I cannot be done. She kept her back straight, her gaze level when she dared to meet Fire Eye's eyes again. She had no weapon, no allies, nothing but her own will. Still, Something told her that was what he was testing, whether she would break before he even raised his blade. The canyon swallowed them whole, and Clara Hayes understood she was no longer free. She was a prisoner, carried into a world from which she might never return. But she also understood something else, faint as a whisper in the back of her mind. As long as his eyes burned on her, she was not yet dead. They brought Clara deeper into Apache Canyon, where the red stone walls narrowed and twisted like a labyrinth. The ground was strewn with boulders and scrub, places where shadows clung even though the sun now burned hot above. She stumbled often, her skirts tangling at her ankles, but the warriors holding her arms gave her no pause. Each time she faltered, they jerked her forward until she learned to keep pace despite the pain blooming in her shoulders. When they finally stopped, she saw it was no random place. The canyon widened into a hidden hollow where smoke from small fires rose into the air. Women moved between skin tents and cook fires. Children darted barefoot over the rocks, and horses grazed tethered along the edge of the clearing. The camp was alive, vibrant, yet as soon as the group appeared with her in tow, silence rippled outward. Every eye turned on her. Clara's heart thumped so hard it hurt. She had never been the center of so much attention, and never in a way that felt so dangerous. The women whispered, the men frowned, and the children gawked as though she were some strange creature pulled from a traveling show. She wanted to shrink back, to disappear, but the warriors dragged her forward until she stood at the center of the camp, exposed before them all. Then he stepped forward, fire eyes. He had ridden ahead after she was captured, and now she saw him clearly for the first time without the chaos of battle or the dust of pursuit. He wore no shirt, only a string of bones at his neck, his chest marked with the ochre streaks of war paint. His hair was long, tied back with leather, his skin bronzed from sun and wind. But it was his eyes that held her, eyes so dark they seemed almost black, and lit from within as if with fire. He said something to the others, sharp and commanding. His voice cut through the murmurs, and though Clara could not understand, she knew he was the one who decided her fate. The crowd obeyed his words. The men at her arms released her, though they stayed close enough to seize her again if she made a move. She rubbed her wrists, red and sore, and lifted her chin. For a long moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. Clara told herself not to look away. Her father had once said that wild dogs can smell fear, that if you break eye contact, they'll know you're prey. She clung to that memory now, though her throat was dry and her legs shook. She met Fire Eye's gaze and refused to drop it, even as her inside screamed for her to flee. He circled her slowly, like a hunter studying unfamiliar quarry. He didn't touch her, not yet, but she felt the weight of his scrutiny on every part of her hair, her plain dress smudged with soot from the wagon fire, her blistered hands. He stopped in front of her again, so close she could see the flecks of red dust clinging to his skin. The silence between them grew unbearable. The camp watched, waiting, but Clara could no longer hold her tongue. "If you mean to kill me," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "do it now." The words seemed to startle even her. She had not planned them, but they spilled out, raw and defiant. A ripple of shock passed through the onlookers. A few laughed, others muttered. Fire Eyes tilted his head, the faintest curve touching his mouth, not quite a smile, not quite contempt. He stepped closer. Clara's heart hammered so violently she thought she might faint. He said something, his tone low and deliberate, but she caught only one word repeated twice. He wanted a response. "I don't understand you," she whispered, his eyes narrowed. Then, to her astonishment, he lifted his hand not to strike, but to point at her chest. Then at his own. A gesture simple, but layered with meaning. She did not know if it was a claim, a warning, or a promise. The stillness stretched on. Clara's mouth was dry as bone, yet she forced herself to whisper, "I will not beg." The camp seemed to breathe in at once, as if her defiance had shifted something unseen. Fire Eyes held her gaze another heartbeat, his eyes burning, unreadable. Then, abruptly, he turned and barked orders. The spell was broken. 2 women came forward, taking Clara roughly by the arms. They led her away toward a low tent, though she looked back once more. He was watching her still. Standing tall, weapon in hand, eyes like coals in the firelight. The standoff was not over, it had only begun. The tent was little more than hide stretched over a wooden frame, yet it swallowed Clara into a darkness that pressed close. The 2 women who had dragged her inside left without a word, their eyes sharp but not unkind. They left her with nothing but the lingering smell of smoke, leather, and herbs. Clara sat stiffly on the ground, her back to the wall of hides. Her wrists throbbed where she had been held, and her throat ached from thirst, but she would not allow herself the comfort of tears. She had given them enough already, her home, her wagon, her freedom. She would not surrender her dignity as well. The flap stirred, and he entered. Fire Eyes. He ducked inside with an ease that suggested the space was his own, though there was no bed, no possessions beyond a few clay pots and a rolled blanket. He carried his knife loosely in one hand, though its edge gleamed even in the dim light. Clara's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she thought he had come to finish what had begun in the canyon. He crouched across from her, silent. The weapon lay balanced across his knees. His gaze roved over her face, unreadable. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. She told herself to be still, but the silence was unbearable. Finally, she blurted the words that had hovered in her chest since the canyon. "I can be a good wife," she said, her voice ragged. "Just don't kill me." The sound of her own voice shocked her. The words had spilled out unbidden, desperate and yet strangely firm. They hung in the air, echoing against the hides. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then his eyes narrowed, the fire in them sharpening. He tilted his head as if weighing her, not as a prisoner now, but as something else entirely. A woman who had bargained for her life in a way no plea for mercy could have done. He said something in his tongue, the syllables slow, deliberate. He repeated it again, as though testing if she would understand. Clara only shook her head, whispering, "I don't know what you mean." His jaw tightened. He lifted the knife, and for an instant her body went cold. But instead of striking, he stabbed it into the dirt between them, the blade quivering. Then he leaned back on his heels, his hands free, his eyes burning into hers. Clara's breath shuddered out of her. He had dropped his weapon, not cast it aside, but planted it where it could be reclaimed in an instant. Still, the gesture was enough. A message. He would not kill her. "Not yet. You hear me?" She whispered, half to herself. "You understand." His expression didn't change, but she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He rose then, unfolding to his full height, the knife still planted between them. He looked down at her for a long heartbeat more, then turned and left the tent without a sound. When the flap closed, Clara collapsed against the hide wall. Her hands shook violently, though she pressed them to her knees to hide it, even though no one was there to see. She had spoken without thought, made a bargain with words she scarcely believed herself. A wife? The idea horrified her, yet if it meant life, if it bought her time, what choice did she have? Outside, the camp stirred again, the sounds of voices, horses, and children carrying faintly. But for Clara, the world had narrowed to a single fact. She had gambled her fate with a promise, and the fire in his eyes when he left told her he had accepted. The day dragged on in fragments of light and shadow. Clara was kept in the tent, guarded by the 2 women who had brought her there. They gave her water in a clay bowl, coarse bread made from ground seeds, and strips of dried meat. She ate sparingly, never letting her eyes leave theirs. They never spoke to her, though one watched with quiet curiosity while the other avoided her gaze entirely. When dusk came, the camp stirred with a different energy. Men returned from scouting, their voices louder, their steps heavier. Children laughed as fires sparked to life, and the scent of roasting meat drifted into the tent. Clara hugged her knees to her chest, the crackle of flames outside reminding her of the wagons burning, of the smoke that had blackened the sky. And then he came. The flap lifted and Fire Eyes entered again. His presence filled the space like a storm rolling over the horizon, silent, heavy, inevitable. He no longer carried his knife, though she had no doubt it was close at hand. His chest was bare, the paint from earlier smudged and faded as though he had washed away the blood of the day. He crouched across from her as before, but this time the silence felt different, charged. Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his eyes. Those eyes burned not only with anger, not only with suspicion. They burned with something deeper, something she could not name. She thought of her words earlier, of the bargain that had slipped from her lips in desperation. I can be a good wife, just don't kill me. Perhaps he was weighing them now. Perhaps he was deciding if her life was worth the risk of sparing. The firelight from outside caught his gaze, turning the dark irises into liquid embers. Clara shivered. It was not only fear, it was something else, a strange pull, like staring too long at a flame until it threatened to consume her. You? Understand me, she whispered, testing the idea aloud. His eyes flickered, but he gave no answer. Instead, he reached forward slowly, deliberately. Clara flinched back, her heart hammering, but he only touched the ground between them, drawing a line in the dirt with his fingertip. Then he tapped one side, then the other. Two halves separated. Clara stared, uncomprehending, until he pointed at her, then at one half. At himself, then the other. A boundary. Two worlds. Her throat tightened. Yes, she whispered, though she knew he could not understand the words. We are not the same. But then his hand swept across the line, erasing it in one motion. His eyes never left hers. Clara's breath caught. Whatever he meant, it was clear. He would not keep her at a distance. Her life, her fate, was now bound to his. Her voice shook. Is that why you let me live? The silence pressed heavy. He leaned closer, so close she could see the faint scars at the edge of his jaw. The way his lips tightened as though holding back words he did not have the language to share. His eyes blazed into hers, and for a moment she felt the ground vanish beneath her, as though she were falling into those embers. She should have looked away. She should have bowed her head, shown submission. Instead, she held on, caught by something beyond fear. At last, he reached for his knife. Clara froze. He drew it from his belt, and for a moment the firelight danced along its edge, cruel and bright. Then he let it fall. The blade struck the dirt beside her, point buried deep. He had not given it to her, but he had placed it within her reach. A test or a declaration? Clara stared at the weapon, then back at him. Her hands trembled, but she did not touch it. She only whispered hoarse, "Why me?" He gave no answer, but his eyes burned still, steady and unrelenting, as if to say the question itself no longer mattered. When he finally left the tent, the knife remained in the dirt between them, and Clara understood that survival was no longer a matter of silence or strength. It was a matter of fire and whether she could endure its gaze without being consumed. The knife stayed buried in the dirt beside Clara long after Fire Eyes left the tent. She had stared at it for hours, her fingers twitching with the urge to grasp it. But what then? A single blade against a camp of warriors, against a man whose very presence seemed to strip the courage from her bones. To reach for it felt like suicide. To leave it felt like surrender. By the time the firelight dimmed and the camp settled into quiet, she realized that the knife wasn't meant to harm her. It was meant to bind her. He had given her the illusion of choice and waited to see what she would do. And she had failed the test. She had chosen to do nothing. When dawn came, the tent flap opened and she was dragged outside. The camp was already awake, men preparing horses, women tending fires, children darting underfoot. But the moment Clara appeared, silence rippled outward. All eyes turned toward her, then toward Fire Eyes, who stood tall at the edge of the gathering. He gestured for her to be brought forward. Clara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself upright, refusing to be dragged like a carcass. The two women who held her arms muttered something, perhaps mocking her defiance, but she ignored them. If she must be paraded before her captors, she would not go bowed. When she reached the circle of warriors, Fire Eyes stepped forward. His knife was back at his side, but she saw the faint smear of dirt on its handle, proof that he had retrieved it himself. One of the older men barked words at him, sharp and furious. Others joined in, voices rising. Clara didn't need to understand the language to know what they demanded: her death. A prisoner was a burden, a risk, a symbol of weakness. Fire Eyes listened without flinching. Then, with a sudden movement, he drew his knife. Clara's breath hitched, the world narrowing to the gleam of steel. He turned toward her and then dropped it. The blade hit the ground between them with a thud, kicking up a puff of dust. The crowd gasped. Some shouted in outrage, others in disbelief. The gesture was unmistakable. He would not kill her. He had placed his weapon down before her, just as he had in the tent, but this time it was not a private test. It was a declaration made before his people. Clara's knees threatened to give way. Her throat burned with unshed tears, not of fear this time, but of something she could not name. Relief? Gratitude? Or the terror of knowing that survival had now bound her to him in ways she didn't understand? The old man who had shouted stepped forward, his hand on his tomahawk. The tension in the air thickened. Clara felt the hostility like a physical weight pressing against her skin. One wrong move and she would be struck down, blade or no blade, but Fire Eyes moved quicker. He shoved the old man back with a single arm, his voice rising in command. His eyes blazed, daring any of them to challenge him. One by one, the warriors' protests fell away, swallowed by his authority. He turned then, fixing his gaze on Clara. For an instant, the camp, the shouting, the danger, all of it blurred. Only his eyes remained, burning into hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. He had chosen. He had claimed her survival not by mercy, but by will. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, muttering among themselves. The old man spat into the dust, his glare heavy with promise. But none dared defy Fire Eyes openly. Not today. Clara realized she was trembling. She pressed her hands together to hide it, though she doubted anyone cared. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tell him she had not asked to be bound to his fate. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she whispered only to herself, "Why?" Fire Eyes stooped, retrieved his knife, and slid it back into its sheath. His gaze lingered on her, steady and unyielding, before he turned away. The blade had fallen, but it was not the weapon that mattered. It was the fire in his eyes, the unspoken vow that had silenced his people. And Clara knew then, her life was no longer hers to bargain. It had been claimed. The days that followed were neither freedom nor imprisonment, but something balanced precariously between the two. Clara was not bound, nor was she cast aside. She was watched always, her every step measured by unseen rules. If she strayed too close to the canyon's edge or lingered too long by the horses, a sharp voice or a tug on her arm reminded her that escape was not an option. Yet no one raised a weapon against her. It was the women who shaped her new existence. At first, they gave her the simplest of tasks, grinding maize with stones, carrying water in heavy clay pots, scraping hides until her arms ached. She did these things silently, stubbornly, refusing to let them see her weakness. Over time, though, the silence softened. One woman, no older than Clara herself, showed her how to knot sinew into thread. Another pressed a strip of roasted meat into her hands without a word. As though acknowledging her place at the fire, Clara learned quickly. She had no choice. Her survival depended not on defiance but on proving that she was useful. And so, her blistered hands grew calloused. Her posture bent to tasks she had never known in her father's tidy farmhouse. She hated it, and yet, in some strange way, she was proud. Each completed task, each nod of approval from the women, was another thread binding her to this place. Still, she did not forget who she was. When she lay down at night in the borrowed furs, she whispered her mother's prayers under her breath. She imagined the clapboard church back home, the hymns rising, her father's hand firm on her shoulder. She thought of the wagon train, the faces lost in fire and smoke. And she thought of the man whose eyes burned like coals fire eyes, who had spared her, who had claimed her life with a dropped blade. He lingered at the edge of her days. Sometimes she saw him with the warriors, his voice carrying across the camp as he gave commands. Sometimes he passed close, and the air seemed to tighten between them, though no word was spoken. He never touched her, never struck her, never laughed as others did. But his gaze found her often steady, unreadable, reminding her that her fate was still his to decide. Clara hated him for that gaze. And yet, she did not fear it as she once had. Somewhere in the weeks of labor and survival, fear had dulled into something else, wariness, curiosity, even though she would not admit it to herself, a strange safety. When he was near, no one dared raise a hand against her. His protection was a shield sharper than steel, but that shield came at a cost. She could feel it in the way the others looked at her, whispers curling like smoke in the dark. Some called her ghost woman, others fire-eyed shadow. She was neither one of them nor fully apart from them. She belonged to two worlds and yet to none. One evening, as the sun bled red over the canyon walls, Clara sat at the fire with the women. A child clambered into her lap, tugging at her hair with curious fingers. Clara laughed, a sound that startled even herself. The laughter carried, and when she glanced up, she saw Fire Eyes watching from across the camp. His expression did not change, but his eyes, those burning eyes, held her for a long moment. Something tightened in her chest. She looked away quickly, focusing on the child. That night, lying on the furs, Clara understood the truth she had tried to ignore. She could no longer pretend she was only a prisoner waiting for rescue. She was part of this place now, however unwillingly. She was useful, she was watched. She was claimed, and yet, when she closed her eyes, she dreamed not of home nor of escape, but of firelight flickering in dark eyes that saw her more clearly than she wished. She was caught between two worlds, and every day that passed pulled her deeper into both. By the time the chill of autumn settled into the canyon, Clara had become a fixture in the camp. She no longer thought of each sunrise as a reprieve from death, but as another step along a path she hadn't chosen. The women trusted her enough to leave children in her care. She stitched hides with a practiced hand and could kindle fire as swiftly as any of them. And though she spoke not a word of their tongue, gestures and glances had become their own language. Yet for every nod of acceptance, there was also a shadow. Clara felt it in the stares of certain men, those who had wanted her gone the day she was captured. They watched her with smoldering contempt, as though every laugh she shared with a child, every task she completed, was a reminder of Fire Eye's defiance of their will. That resentment grew heavier after a raid, returned with fewer warriors than had left. Men bled out on hides. Women keened into the night, and the whispers carried sharp. The ghost woman brought misfortune. She curses us. She weakens him. Clara heard none of the words directly, but she felt them. The air itself grew colder when she passed, her presence a wedge that split the camp. It was during one of those nights of mourning that she saw Fire Eyes differently. He sat apart, his head bowed, a streak of blood still drying on his cheek. The fire painted him in gold and shadow, and for the first time, Clara saw not a conqueror but a man carrying the weight of his people. His eyes burned still, but now they burned with grief. Without thinking, she crossed the space between them. The others watched, their murmurs sharp, but Fire Eyes did not stop her. She knelt, lifted a cloth, and touched it gently to his cheek. He flinched at first, then stilled, watching her with that same unbearable intensity. The air thickened around them, firelight flickering in both their eyes. No words passed. Yet Clara knew something had shifted. She was no longer just a burden he had chosen to protect. She was a part of his survival, as he was of hers, but the camp did not see it that way. The betrayal came quietly at first. A ration of food missing from where she had set it aside. A sharp shove when no one else was watching. A child warned away from her lap. Small acts, designed to remind her that she did not belong. Then came the night of the ambush. Clara was tending the fire near her tent when she overheard them. 3 warriors crouched in the shadows, voices hushed but urgent. She caught only fragments, but the tone was unmistakable. Their eyes cut toward Fire Eyes' lodge, then toward her. One man drew his finger across his throat. Her blood went cold. She could have stayed silent. She could have told herself she had misheard. But when she thought of Fire Eyes, his fire-lit eyes, the grief etched into his face. The knife he had dropped again and again rather than use against her, she couldn't remain still. Clara ran. She burst into his lodge, startling him from sleep. The words tangled in her mouth, useless in a language he did not know. She grasped his arm, pulled him toward the shadows outside, shaking her head furiously, heart pounding. The attack came swiftly. The 3 warriors closed in, blades glinting, eyes set with fury. Clara pushed herself between them and Fire Eyes without thinking, arms spread wide, voice breaking as she cried out, "No! Don't!" For a heartbeat, everything froze. The men hesitated, shocked by her defiance. Fire Eyes moved like a storm unleashed. His knife flashed, his voice thundered, and the camp erupted in chaos. By dawn, the traitors were gone, driven out, or left lifeless in the dust. Clara sat trembling by the fire, blood that was not her own smeared across her hands. Fire Eyes knelt before her, his breath ragged, his eyes burning not with fury this time, but with something she could not name. She had risked her life for his. He had shed blood for hers. In that moment, Clara understood that survival had transformed into something far more dangerous. It was no longer about bargains, no longer about fear. It was about trust. It was about fire. And it was about a bond that neither love nor war could break unless betrayal found them first. The camp smoldered in the dawn after the betrayal. Ashes drifted on the wind like pale feathers, caught in the tangled hair of children and the smoke-streaked shawls of women. The bodies of the 3 men who had raised their blades against Fire Eyes had been carried beyond the canyon walls, their absence as loud as any war cry. Clara sat near the embers of the fire, her hands still raw from the night before. She had scrubbed them until her skin stung, yet she could not wash away the memory, the weight of her scream, the flash of knives, the sound of death in the darkness. Her stomach churned with it. Survival had always been her single goal, but now she realized she had crossed a line. She had chosen not just to live, but to protect him. When Fire Eyes came to her, she lifted her head slowly. His face was shadowed by fatigue, his eyes bloodshot, but the fire within them had not dimmed. If anything, it burned hotter, as though the struggle had only stoked what lay at his core. He crouched before her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin. He spoke in his tongue, low and deliberate, and though she caught no words, she knew their weight. He was asking her to stand with him, truly, fully, not as a prisoner, not even as a burden he had spared, but as something more. Her throat tightened. "I don't understand you," she whispered, though in her heart she did. She understood perfectly. A silence stretched between them, heavy and endless. Then he did something she had never expected. He drew his knife, not in threat, but in ritual. He pressed the edge lightly against his own palm, enough to draw a bead of blood, then offered the hilt to her. Clara froze. The gesture was unmistakable. He was binding her, offering her the place by his side, marking her as his in the only language his people respected. It was protection, it was possession, it was promise all at once. Her hands shook as she reached for the knife. She could take it, cut her own palm, seal the bond. Or she could refuse, step back into the ashes of a life that no longer existed. For a moment, she saw both paths at once. She saw her father's farm, the whitewashed church, the lives lost on the trail. She saw the world she had known, and the world she now stood in the canyon walls. The firelight, the eyes that had spared her when all reason said she should be dead. Her lips trembled. "If I do this," she whispered, "there's no going back." He did not answer with words. His eyes burned into hers, steady, unflinching, as if to say there was never any going back. Clara inhaled sharply, the desert air cutting her lungs. She closed her fingers around the hilt. The blade was warm from his hand, heavy with meaning. Slowly, deliberately, she drew it across her palm. Pain flared bright, sharp as lightning, followed by the warm trickle of blood. She met his gaze as she pressed her cut to his. Skin to skin, blood to blood. His hand closed firmly over hers, the bond sealed in silence. The fire between them became something undeniable, terrifying, and yet grounding. The camp murmured, some in shock, others in resignation. She was no longer simply the ghost woman. She was his, and by that act, she belonged to the people, whether they welcomed her or not. But even as the warmth of the fire seeped into her bones, Clara knew the choice was not without cost. She had tied herself to Fire Eyes, to his people, to a future she could not predict. There would be battles ahead of loyalty, of blood, of trust. She had traded one world for another, and the line between them was gone forever. When the flames died lower and the camp grew still, Clara sat beside him. Her hand throbbed, bound in cloth, yet she felt strangely steady. She had bargained once for her life with desperate words. "I can be a good wife. Just don't kill me." Now she realized it had never been about bargains. It had been about fire and whether she could stand inside it without burning away, and she chose to stand.